Now, what do we make of these texts? Now, if we grow up in our own religious tradition, whoever we are, we assume that our tradition is a religion of compassion and love and truth, because this is the kind of families that we grew up in, the kind of communities that we lived in. And we expect that from our tradition. When we see references to us in somebody else's tradition, we take affront at it. We're very upset. We tend to judge, and this is a methodology that is an inherent human trait. That is, we tend to judge the best of our tradition with the worst of their tradition. It's just the way we are. We tend to resonate with the love of our tradition. We tend to feel threatened and uncomfortable with the hate or the anger in the tradition of the other. That's a normal human response, but it's not a very accurate reading of the way Scripture actually works. In some of my teaching, I have these little games that we play. One of them is, Judaism is a religion of violence. Islam is a religion of peace. And I lay out a half a dozen texts of violence from the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and a half a dozen texts of reconciliation and peace seeking and in the Quran. And then the next, you turn the page and you see Islam is a religion of violence and Judaism is a religion of peace. And you simply flip them because there are confined texts that support both of these positions in our traditions. For the Christians in the room, you probably might, or you may be feeling, well, we don't really have so much of the violence in our tradition. Our tradition really is more of a tradition of love than in either of those situations. And I think that actually is true. But as a historian of religion, I want to tell you why I think it's true, and then I want to kind of even this out, and then I'd like to have an open discussion. The moment of a birth of religion has a huge impact on the way it sees itself and the way it views the world at its moment of emergence. That is, the moment the birth pangs of a religion has an impact on the way it views itself and the way it views the world. But it doesn't always remain with that worldview. I'm going to work it through history. The first of the Abrahamic or scriptural traditions to emerge into history that we know of is that of the ancient Israelites in the ancient Near East. And the Israelites emerged into a social political environment in which there were no empires at the time. There were numbers of tribal communities. Each tribal community was more or less the same size and more or less the same strength. And they fought each other for resources, for access to trade routes, for labor, as in stealing somebody else's bodies for slaves, and belongings and what have you. It wasn't there was no universal law to determine that these kinds of behaviors were correct or were not correct. And every community in the ancient Near East had its own cultural and sometimes even legal system, but the cultural and legal system was really designed for the community. It wasn't designed for the world. It didn't think in terms of empire. It didn't think in terms of universal categories. It thought in terms of kind of tribal units. And that's the way it functioned. Now, even the 10 Commandments that we see from the Torah, that's my tradition. The 10 Commandments really is for the Israelites. It's not for treating the Egyptians, right? Or the Moabites, or the Canaanites, or the Amalekites who happen to live in the vicinity. That moral ethical system, which I think is not a bad one, is really an internal system. It's not a universal system. And so in those days, you won some battles and you lost some battles. If you didn't fight, you wouldn't survive. It's simple as that. The environment, now I'm going to skip way ahead to the environment of the emergence of Islam. Islam emerged into history in the 7th century in Arabia. Arabia, 7th century, that's 2 millennia after the emergence of the Israelite tradition. Right? The Israelite tradition emerged 1000 BCE, 1300 BCE, something like that. So Islam emerged much, much later. But social economically, it was a similar situation. Arabia was always outside the reach of the empires, the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, Persian Empire, Roman Empire. It was an independent area. Some people ask, well, why would we want it? Maybe. But in any case, in Arabia, that was because they hadn't created the, the combustion engine yet? So in Arabia, there was a kind of tribal organization that was in many respects similar to the tribal organization in the ancient Near East. And all the tribal communities were in a state of essentially perpetual conflict with other tribal communities. They needed to fight one another for scarce resources, and they were very scarce in Arabia at the time. They needed to fight one another to control trade routes, to control access to water, to control access to grazing areas. And so they won a few and they lost a few. And the revelation of the Quran, like the revelation of the Hebrew Bible, includes edicts and commands to go out and fight the people who are threatening you, because that was the way for a religious community to survive. So what do I draw from this? I draw from this one general rule of the way religion functions. And we'll get to Christianity in a moment. Religion emerges into history as an institution in order to protect the needs of the believers, the members of that community that is represented by the religion. Just like the Ten Commandments is not assumed by the Ten Commandments itself to apply to non-Israelites, so too the rules about war and peace and relations between one community and other communities is not expected to apply to people who are outside the community of believers. This is the way it was in the ancient Near East. It was the way it was in Arabia in the 7th century. Christianity emerged into history in a different environment. The environment in which Christianity emerged into history was an environment of an overwhelmingly powerful empire, the Roman Empire. And wasn't an even playing field in which you win some battles and you lose some battles. If you lose big time. And at the time, in the generation of Jesus, and in the generations prior to Jesus, we know from writers such as Josephus, there were other prophetic figures that felt, just like the new Christians did, that the Roman Empire is an evil empire that's preventing them from worshiping their God in peace, forcing them to make sacrifices to the emperor or to the gods of the pantheon, not allowing them to really flourish and develop their own religious systems. And they observed what happened when these communities decided that they would put an end to the Roman Empire, because they would fight with them and God would help them in their righteous battles. One very famous community that did that was the Jews. What happened to the Jews when they went up against the Roman Empire? The temple was destroyed by the Romans. The community was decimated by the Romans. The Jews were, I'm very happy to say, very proud to say, Jews were stupid enough to try it twice. The second time was the Bar Kokhba rebellion. The first time started in the year 66 of the Common Era, resulted in the destruction of the temple and terrible massacres of Jews. The second revolt was the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 132. It resulted really in even more devastation to the Jewish community, and it actually made the whole area of Judah Judenrein. The Jews were forced out of their land, and Jews within eyesight of Jerusalem could be killed on the spot by a Roman legionnaire by law. Now, the early Christians observed this. Would it not be surprising that the New Testament would not include calls for fighting in one's own defense? In fact, and this is something that I find just really fascinating and very important, I don't believe that the New Testament is at all pacifist. I think it's quietist, but extremely activist. It's almost like guerrilla theater. If he hit you, yeah, try it again, right? Just do it again. You want my cloak? You want my shirt? You stealing that from me? Here, take this too. It's a kind of in-your-face response. But that's because any kind of physical reaction or militant reaction would have resulted in probably terrible destruction. And so Christianity, in the earliest texts of Christianity, like the earliest texts of Judaism and Islam, which is scripture, encodes that moment of emergence. In the Hebrew Bible, warring is acceptable. In the Quran, warring is acceptable because it was necessary. In the New Testament, warring is not acceptable because it would be self-destructive. And yet, within a few generations, or a few centuries, once the Roman Empire becomes a Christian Roman Empire, ways are found to justify the employment of imperial armies in massive violence against the enemies of Christianity and the Christian community in the name of religion. And this was part of the program of, I mean, there was much more to it than, but Augustine was engaged in the whole just war theory was significantly a response to the tremendous arming, if you will, of the Christian world when the Roman Empire became the Christian Roman Empire. So what I'm trying to say with this unpleasant little scenario is that we all have in our history a history of violence as a way of protecting our community, and we also have histories of other strategies as well. I should just mention that in the Jewish case, after the second attempt to invoke God's anger against the evil Roman Empire and its utter failure, the rabbis, the survivors of that debacle, essentially retooled Judaism into a quietist religion. And it has remained that way really until the modern period. And in the modern period, with the rise of the State of Israel, because again there is a need, a sensed need for the protection of the community, of the religious community, to reinvoke some of these notions and symbols of militancy and defense and engagement. So we find in the Orthodox community since 1948, and especially since 1967 and 73, a kind of revival of some of the old biblical paradigms of engaging in war. So that's a kind of a moment. Part two, in my general viewpoint, is the relationship between a newly emerging religion and those religions that already exist. So we all, those of us who are religiously inclined, we all grow up in a religion in which we acknowledge the difficulties that our community had in the ancient world as it was trying to establish itself as a new religion. And there were established religions and established communities that were trying to destroy us, whether we are Jews or Christians or Muslims. The same essential story occurs. In the emergence of Christianity, the establishment religion was two. There were two. One was establishment Judaism, and the other one was a Roman religion. It was associated with the empire. Neither of those religions liked the idea of a new religion coming into history and taking away believers from the other tradition. We don't actually like it in our day either, do we? What do we call new religions today? If you're, on a good day, sect, more likely probably cult, right? So we don't, how do we know that the prophet of a new religious community is not being spoken to by God? How do we know that the guru, right, which already is a negative term, only here in India it's actually quite a positive term, means a teacher. How do we know that leader is not truly associated in receiving revelations, not truly being sent by God? The answer is really quite simple. We know it because this is not our religion. When Jesus came into the world, the Jewish community and the Romans were the establishment religions, and they tried all they could to prevent his success, and they failed. But they did a lot of damage. And the reaction to that damage, and the anger, the rage, and the hurt that resulted from all those bad things that were done to that new nascent and lovely community became encoded in the text of divine scripture. And what we read today, and the references to the Pharisees and scribes, and the references in John to the Jews as children of the devil, are reactions by a new religious community to the establishment trying to prevent them from succeeding.